The last video stopped with this slide explaining how we get to increased blood volume, and we want to add a little bit more detail to this idea. I'm asking you about the hormonal control of osmolarity and blood pressure, and to link that to what you remember about signal transduction and negative feedback phases. So it starts with a signal, and the signal here is that the blood osmolarity increases, such as after sweating profusely because you're losing water, and that increases the concentration of your solutes in the blood. This information, as discussed before, is sent to the hypothalamus, which is the sensor and control center, which, as a response to this, releases ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which can be considered an effector. And we discussed that earlier. The phases are artificial. Of course, the hypothalamus is also an effector, because in order for ADH to be released, the hypothalamus has to release it. So let's just stick with this idea here that hypothalamus is the sensor, could be considered an effector. It releases the effector ADH that will then trigger the response, number one, in the distal tubules of the collecting duct, which will increase water reabsorption. There is a second response, and that is that the hypothalamus, through your neurons, through your nervous system, generate thirst that will lead you to drinking more water, and both of these effects together will increase the blood volume and dilute the solutes in the blood, and therefore bring the blood osmolarity back into the normal range of 285 to 295 milliosmol per liter. The question is, how does ADH decrease the blood osmolarity? And in this figure from your book, you will see it explained. So the first step is that ADH travels to the distal tubules and binds to receptors on the collecting duct cells. Sorry, I said distal tubules, I meant collecting duct. So ADH binds to receptors on the collecting duct cells, and that triggers a response, a signal transduction pathway, using our old acquaintance, the second messenger camp, a small, non-protein, easy diffusing molecule that is cheap, which then activates protein kinase A, which is always there but turned off. The protein kinase A activation then leads to storage vesicles with aquaporins embedded to be inserted by exocytosis into the membrane of the collecting duct, and that leads to more uptake of water. So these ready-made vesicles that are ready to be embedded in the cell membrane, we have encountered several times before. Once we talked about the glucose transporters, and the second time was when we talked about vesicles containing neurotransmitters. So because we have now more aquaporins, more water can be reabsorbed into our body, into our bloodstream. And because we have more water returned to the blood, the solutes in the blood are diluted. In this question, I'm asking you whether the release of ADH is an example of negative or of positive feedback. And I hope that all of you remember that, of course, it is negative feedback, because we are bringing blood osmolarity back to set point. As we saw in the previous slide, there are two responses and effectors. One is the neurons triggering thirst, and the other was our cells. Neurons actually releasing ADH in the posterior pituitary. So what I find interesting is this figure here. On the y-axis, you can see the plasma concentration of antidiuretic hormone, and on the x-axis, you can see the plasma osmolarity. So here it's meant blood plasma. And you can see as plasma osmolarity increases, so does then the concentration of antidiuretic hormone, while thirst comes into play at a much higher plasma osmolarity than the release of antidiuretic hormone. It's almost as if your body was thinking, oh, let's not bother her with thirst and drinking. Let's just try to regulate this on our own with the release of ADH. But if the blood osmolarity becomes too high, and obviously the ADH alone cannot deal with this, then thirst kicks in and you should really, really drink. Consider this little review question. ADH is released in response to what? Decreased blood pressure or increased blood osmolarity? Hopefully you have realized that those two are related and that both A and B are correct. And this is it, folks, for this chapter. You made it. Well, you still have to learn it.